Hey everyone, I've been meaning to get back to doing library document discussions, but this actually was something I stumbled on while doing link testing on some of our government documents today, and I'm just sitting here going, you know what? Let me read this to you. Hopefully it won't take too long, because I know it says it's 40 pages, but I have, ADD, so I can read really fast. If you need me to, I can slow down. So, you can change the setting. Anyway, how would this affect the US federal budget? These three guys are from American Enterprise Institute, and it's Alex Brill, Brian J. Miller, and Stan Vlager. Maybe pronouncing Stan's name wrong. And updated as of this year. And we have an abstract. Federal legislation to legalize, regulate, and tax cannabis could have significant impacts on the federal budget. While the specific details of any potential cannabis legalization legislation are unknown at present, such reforms are likely to affect both tax receipts and federal outlays through a wide range of mechanisms, including excise tax collections, changes in size and composition of the labor force, and the major federal healthcare programs. We identify the main federal budgetary implications of legalizing cannabis and estimate their likely magnitude where possible. So, introduction. While the precise contours of future federal legislation and executive action to legalize, regulate, and tax cannabis remain unknown, such policies could have significant impacts on the federal budget. Revenue impacts could arise as a result of new excise taxes, regulatory fees, and changes in labor supply. Outlay impacts could include reduced expenditures on prohibition enforcement and increased expenditures on prescription cannabis and cannabis product regulation, offset by potential cost savings on other healthcare services. Consequences for key public health and social outcomes, such as crime, traffic fatalities, and educational achievement, could also have both positive and negative budgetary implications. This paper seeks to identify the main federal budgetary impacts of legalizing cannabis and estimate their potential magnitude where possible. This exercise assumes that federal legislation will legalize, regulate, and tax both medical and recreational cannabis, and that states and localities will follow suit. Yes, as opposed to the let's just decriminalize entirely and let people grow things and, go about their business. We improve over the limited prior work in this area by analyzing a much wider set of sources and federal revenue and spending of federal revenue. For example, while we follow the approach of Mirren and Waldock in some respects, we add to their analysis by studying additional types of revenue from taxes and fees as well as healthcare spending. The other main set of estimates, prepared by the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee of Taxation, was produced in the context of specific proposed legislation that also covers a narrower range of potential implications for revenue and spending. So, our key findings on the revenue side are that the largest potential effect arises from an increase in labor force participation, while increases in tax revenue from an excise tax, net of expected offsetting factors on cannabis, could be significant as well. Yeah, I've said that. If we're all happy, we might actually be working. And there might also be, opportunities for people to get different jobs. And as anyone in Michigan can tell you, feel free to, tax our sins and fix the damn roads. Anyway, yeah. On the spending side, whether cannabis products will be treated as normal prescription drugs will be crucial to the budgetary effects of legalization by triggering spending on cannabis through the Medicare, Medicaid, and Veterans Health programs. Yeah, that I have not thought through. This paper is organized as follows. We first summarize the legal and budgetary status quo, including state tax revenue collections, before providing an estimate of the likely size of current illicit cannabis market and the impact of federal legalization on market size. The next section discusses expected federal revenue and outlay effects. The paper concludes with a discussion of key issues. So, the status quo. Oh, and I did want to interject before we get going too much further. Normally, this might be considered a copyright violation, but this is a government document produced for the United States. So, my reading this entire thing into YouTube is not violating anyone's creative copyright. Just so we're clear. Normally, you have to provide a little bit more commentary, but in this case, again, I'm reading government docs, which you all should read too. I'm just shortcutting the joy of finding interesting stuff. All right. I'll keep going. The status quo, as we well know, as of February 2024, 38 states, 3 territories, and the District of Columbus have legalized medical cannabis, while 24 states, 2 territories, and the District of Columbia have legalized cannabis for recreational purposes. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services recently recommended rescheduling cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, potentially opening up a path to subsequent partial federal legalization through the creation of a pathway for medicinal use as a controlled substance should the DEA issue a similar finding. Nationwide, more than 58% of the U.S. population 18 and over live in a state that has legalized cannabis for medicinal purpose or recreational or both. Makes sense to me. And look, here's a happy little chart created with Data Wrapper. States shown as blue have only the medical cannabis. States marked with yellow are the places to go if you want to have fun. And states marked as gray are just sad and no one should move there. Okay, I'm sorry. That's an opinion. Not part of this study. Auxier and RE find that revenues from the taxation of recreational cannabis at the state level range from $28.7 million in Alaska to nearly $775 million in California in 2022. And I'm sorry if I butcher your names, you can butcher mine. On a per capita basis, Washington State and Colorado and Nevada collected the most cannabis tax revenue, and medical cannabis tax rates are relatively low, and consumption is limited by obstacles like doctor's appointments and applications. Yeah, I feel you. You show me a form, I'm done. Auxier and RE leave these revenues out of their analysis. Fair enough. As we discussed below, federal legalization is likely to change conditions in the legal cannabis market significantly. And then the appendix table 1 provides details on states that have legalized cannabis, including years of medical and recreational total rev per capita cannabis revenues where available. So yay, additional information. The cannabis market. A budgetary analysis of cannabis legalization relies heavily on an estimate of the amount of cannabis consumption after federal legalization. A starting point for this estimate is current national retail expenditure on cannabis. From there, one can make adjustments based on how legalization is expected to change both demand and supply. Existing research on the effect of medical or recreational cannabis legalization on cannabis consumption generally finds modest positive effects. This suggests that demand will not shift dramatically as further legalization occurs. Therefore, we follow a approach similar to that of Miron and Waldock, who assume that consumption of and spending on cannabis change only due to supply-side shifts in response to legalization. I can kind of see that, and someone who is in a market where the supply side is overflowing, yeah, does drive down prices. At some point, I assume it'll stabilize once, like, the national world gets itself sorted. Anyway, we begin with a 2016 estimate of national retail expenditures on cannabis from the researchers at RAND of $60.6 billion. We scale this by the increase in the U.S. population and consumer price level from 2016 to 2024. We also adjust for changes in the 30-day rate of cannabis usage by adults 19 to 30, with data available up to 2020 and extrapolated to 2024. Based on those adjustments, the market in 2024 would be $95 billion, absent any change in policy, as shown in Table 1. As an alternative estimate, we update Miron and Waldock's extrapolation of the 2000 ONDCP estimate for consumer expenditure on cannabis, $13.13 billion, and adjusting for inflation, population growth, increase in drug usage, the cannabis market size in 2024 using this method would be $58.8 billion. And again, this is 2022 dollars, which, I don't know, I feel like it add, 1.5 times because our inflation's going crazy right now. But that's a whole nother discussion. Anyway, following Miron and Waldock, and based on the comparison between prices in the United States and the Netherlands, which I didn't realize this until quite recently, but I think this is why we are overflowing with the cannabis where I am. I'm like, oh yeah, we were colonized by the Dutch. I totally forgot about that until a few weeks ago. I'm like, this all makes so much sense now. That's why we have beer and cannabis. Come to my side of Michigan. We have fun here. Okay, where was I? Following Miron and Waldock, I had to take a sip. And based on the comparison between prices in the United States and the Netherlands, where starting in the 1970s, consumption and regulated retail sale of cannabis were fully decriminalized, we assume that post-federal legalization prices would be half of current prices. Yeah, half or less, man. The bottom dropped out compared to what we used to pay when it was illegal. We follow the same authors in assuming the elasticity of demand for cannabis is a negative 0.5 and assume demand would not otherwise shift after legalization. Yeah, you can either like it or you don't. Unlike beer, where people are like, you will learn to like it. That is, prices will fall on a legal market as product suppliers would no longer incur the costs associated with federal prohibition. Multi-state operators could achieve economies of scale, and consumers would increase their consumption only due to lower prices. Under these conditions, we estimate the cannabis market size in 2024 would be 59.4 billion, as shown in Table 1. We further expand upon the methodology in Appendix A, which we're not reading to you. I'm sure you're super excited. Yeah, all this exciting stuff in the table. I don't feel like reading that. All right. Revenue and outlay effects. Revenues generated from cannabis legalization will largely depend on tax rates and bases. At the federal level, the most significant revenue source is excise tax. Other relevant sources of revenue include the corporate income tax and individual income and payroll taxes, potential revenue from increased economic activity, and fee revenue. Excise tax revenue. If all 59.4 billion in projected cannabis sales in 2024 were subject to a 10% federal excise tax, federal tax revenues would increase by nearly 6 billion. Yeah, we could pay off our debt with this sort of stuff. Appendix Table 2 shows how much of this revenue is expected to be associated with each state, assuming market size is proportional to either population or GDP. So in Michigan's case, we'd be smaller because we keep losing people. Appendix Table 3 shows the implications for federal revenue if revenue is only collected on sales that have currently legalized a medical cannabis or both medical and recreational cannabis. These estimates are, however, overly high for 3 reasons. First, the illicit cannabis market will not be eliminated. Illicit cannabis may be more affordable and or more accessible than legalized cannabis. This is kind of the problem they're having in California. Like, California over-legislated things to the point where it's essentially stifled its own market. New York is kind of the same way, where it's like, you guys have over-regulated it to the point where people are just not even going to bother going through the hoops. So yeah, there's a thin balance there. Specifically, high tax rates and stringent regulation may deter customers from purchasing cannabis from legal sources. Yeah, and if you overtax it, then, people will go to the back door. But I think that's also an issue, and you guys might think. Section, if consumption of alcohol, tobacco, or other goods that are subject to an excise tax changes, revenues from those excise taxes change as well. The impact will hinge on the degree to which cannabis is a substitute for or complement to these other products. If cannabis is a complement to alcohol or tobacco, this means that as cannabis consumption increases, so does the consumption of and income tax revenue from the complementary goods. On the other hand, if cannabis is a substitute for alcohol or tobacco, legalization will lead to a decline in consumption of the substitute goods and subsequently a decline in excise tax revenues from those substitutable products. I'm not quite sure if it's like a substitute sort of thing. I guess if you want it to be legal, but they create very different effects. So, like, they kind of go together. Like, people who are drinking usually add cannabis on, but I've never really seen one person be like, oh, it's illegal, so I just drink more, and then switch the other. Yeah, I don't know. I don't see that, but that's just me. I think the problem lies more if you overtax the dispensaries to the point where they just don't want to deal with people. Empirical evidence indicates cannabis legalization will likely crowd out existing excise tax revenue by reducing alcohol consumption, based on research on existing legalization efforts. Yeah, I guess I could see that. Using individual-level survey data on self-reported alcohol consumption from the Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System, they find that laws legalizing cannabis for medicinal purposes were associated with decreases in past-month alcohol use. Specifically, Anderson, Hansen, and Reese, using 1993 to 2020 data, find that these laws were associated with a 4% decrease in the probability of past-month alcohol use. Sabia, Swigert, and Young, using 1992 to 2012 data, find that these laws were associated with a 3.1% reduction. Although this is over 10 years old, so I'm not certain it's applicable. Using retail scanner data from the U.S.-Canada border country pairs, Baggio, Zhang, and Quan, find that these laws were associated with 12% decrease in retail alcohol sales. So maybe that's why it's getting blocked, because cannabis was originally criminalized because of its association with Mexican immigrants, kind of like opium and the Chinese. So maybe this is another reason why it gets blocked. We need to maintain the alcohol monopoly. For laws legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes, Miller and CO find a 5% decrease in alcohol consumption using retail scanner data from Washington State. Extrapolating this result to the federal level, a 5% decline in alcohol consumption would reduce federal revenue from the alcohol excise tax by $500 million. The recent evidence from cannabis legalization is more mixed about whether cannabis and tobacco are substitutes. In their sample of college-age adults, Alley, Kerr, and Bay find no evidence of an association between tobacco use and laws legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes. Anderson, Matsuzawa, and Sabia used 1991 to 2017 data from the National and State Youth Risk Behavior Surveys and find that increased cigarette taxes reduce cigarette consumption without affecting cannabis consumption. Miller and Co, on the other hand, find laws that legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes in Washington state are associated with a 5% decrease in cigarette demand. And third, net excise tax revenue will be lower than gross excise tax revenue due to decreases in income and payroll taxes. When a new excise tax is imposed or existing excise tax rates are increased, the tax burden will be shared by producers and consumers. If the burden of the tax is entirely on producers, the receipts will decrease by the amount of tax, resulting in a decline in wages and profits. This in turn will reduce the individual and corporate income tax and payroll tax bases. On the other hand, if consumers bear the full burden of the tax, the price of the tax goods will rise by the amount of the tax. This will result in consumers having less money to spend on other goods and services. As a consumer spending on non-tax goods declines, the taxable income of the producers of the non-tax good declines, also reducing the individual and corporate income and payroll tax bases. This effect is known as the income and payroll tax offset. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimates that this offset amounts to roughly 1/4 of excise tax revenues. So what I'm getting out of this, and maybe somebody else can correct me if I'm wrong, they're worried about not having enough tax from the people who are already producing alcohol for the alcohol consumption market, because if their user base drops, then they're going to have to somehow come up with that revenue gap in order to stay profitable, in which case might involve laying people off or possibly trying to increase the price of the product, which is going to mess with other people's disposable income. I can kind of see it, but again, I don't feel like they have as much of an overlapping Venn diagram user base. And this also doesn't address like the thing that, the offset would also come with the fact that there'd be like a whole bunch of new businesses opening, which could also, again, give you people to tax. But maybe we'll get to that later. Federal cannabis excise tax of 10% will therefore certainly yield significantly less on net than 10% of total revenue in the market. The likely decline in alcohol excise tax revenues and the tax offset effect would reduce the revenues in the example above by more than 1/3, from nearly $6 billion to less than $4 billion. This lower number would still be an upper bound because it assumes no illicit market. Note that the specific rate and design of the tax matter tremendously for expected revenue. For example, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, H.R. 3617 in the 117th Congress, would have introduced an excise tax at a lower rate of 8% and an earlier stage in the supply chain, applied to the so-called removal price, the price at which producers, as opposed to retailers, sell their product. JCT estimates that the excise tax in the MORE Act would raise just under $6 billion over the full 10-year budget window. But Lord, could we use $6 billion? All right, gotta get another sip, sorry. There's also significant uncertainty associated with the size of the post-legalization cannabis market. Marin and Waldock derived their aforementioned assumption of prices going down by 50% from the experience of the Netherlands under pseudo-legislation. Perot finds short-run black market price reduction of 18% across a range of decriminalization and partial legalization measures in the United States. As Jacob and Sovini emphasize, this kind of estimate does not fully account for changes to access and stigma that would accompany full legalization and likely understates the price drop from full legalization. Marin and Waldock assume price elasticity of demand approximately -0.5 is a relatively conservative one. Hansen et al., for example, estimate a short-run elasticity of -0.4 and a longer-run elasticity of -1, while Hollenbeck and Uitake similarly produce an estimate of around -1. Table 2 shows what various price effects and demand elasticities would mean for excise tax revenue. Exciting stuff. So, yeah. This I don't necessarily understand so much. This is where my accounting is like, woo! Alright. This table shows revenue estimates in billions of 2022 dollars for a 10% excise tax on cannabis, adjusted for income and payroll tax offsets, and crowding out of alcohol tax revenue for various assumed price declines and demand elasticities. A price decline of 50% are baseline assumptions associated with a scenario where prices are halved after legalization. And that's actually a pretty conservative estimate, because, like, halved, I think, is when we first had legalization up here. Now it's like, I don't know, maybe a quarter of what it used to be when it was illegal. And the elasticity demand of negative 0.5, our baseline assumption, indicates that when prices go up or down by 1%, demand goes down or up by 0.5%. So, tariff revenue. Turning to the international dimension of excise tax, we find it unlikely that legal importation of cannabis will be allowed, at least initially. As a result, customs duties will not be collected. However, lawmakers are likely to enact a tariff equivalent to the excise tax, even if imports are initially disallowed. Yeah, we've grown up local that this is not a discussion, really. Other tax revenue, corporate income, individual income, and payroll taxes paid by cannabis producers, wholesalers, retailers, and their employees will constitute additional revenue to the extent that existing untaxed illicit cannabis activity becomes subject to taxation. However, existing cannabis businesses will pay lower federal taxes once they can deduct all business expenses, which offsets this private effect on revenue to some extent. Specifically, IRS Code Section 280E disallows businesses from claiming deductions for ordinary and necessary business expenses associated with trafficking in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 controlled substances. Such disallowed expenditures exclude wages and salaries paid to sell product, rent, and marketing costs. However, the cost of goods sold, known more formally as the expenditures necessary to acquire, construct, or extract a physical product which is to be sold, which is akin to the direct cost of inventory for a retailer, is not excluded by 280E. In short, 280E results in the tax base for cannabis businesses to be gross income rather than net income. And as a result, the effective tax rate on a cannabis business is significantly higher than for an ordinary business, permitted to deduct all reasonable costs and expenses. If the DEA recommends, as Health and Human Services did, that cannabis reschedule from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, Section 280E will no longer apply. Yeah, okay. Rather than net income. Okay, because net income is after you can deduct your expenses. All right, accounting fund. The MORE Act would have legalized cannabis, thereby exempting cannabis businesses from Section 280E. It would also have imposed an excise tax phased into 8% at the production as opposed to the retail stage of the supply chain as discussed earlier. Yeah, ours is on the retail end. I don't know if they're doing anything to production in Michigan, but it's definitely on the retail end. Finally, it would have introduced a $1,000 annual occupational fee on any person engaged in a business as a producer or an export warehouse proprietor. JCT estimates that net excise tax revenues would be over $5.66 billion over the period 2023 to 2031, and other revenues would reach $2.42 billion over the same period. Note that the other revenue stream, according to JCT, would be negative in the first 3 years before turning positive due to the timing effects of deductions and other expected market dynamics. The expected revenue impact in 2031 alone from the MORE Act is $1.4 billion. In the current Congress, H.R. 2643, the Small Business Tax Equity Act of 2023, would amend Section 280E to exclude marijuana sales conducted in compliance with state law. Similar legislation has been introduced previously in both the House and the Senate, whether by excluding state legal cannabis sales from 280E explicitly, rescheduling cannabis by the DEA, or by other such means as the removal of cannabis from the Schedule of Controlled Substance by statute. The practical tax effect would be the same, permitting cannabis businesses to deduct all business expenses, not only cost of goods sold. The impact on the business entity would be very significant. Illustrative examples from the cannabis industry indicate such businesses can pay effective tax rates of 70%. The net effect on revenue from corporate income, individual income, and payroll taxes paid by cannabis producers, wholesalers, retailers, and their employees will then depend on the extent to which the rate reduction offsets the base increase. Okay, so revenue from increased economic activity. Assuming a fixed capital stock and constant labor force participation, new cannabis-related economic activity will crowd out both existing activity in other industries and the corresponding tax revenue. It will only generate differential revenue in profit rates and or wages are greater or lower than the status quo. Okay, so I think that's saying, like, it's going to take people from other industries, but it's going to pay them about the same. Unless they decide to pay them differently. Of course, the assumption of constant labor participation may be unrealistic. Yeah, let's talk about Gen Z. Abuk et al., using current population survey data from 2011 to 2019, find that legalization of recreational cannabis is associated with a decrease in the propensity to receive workers' compensation benefits and benefit amounts. Yeah, because they drug test you and then they're like, you're a drug addict, so yeah, we're not giving you nothing. Based on 2010 to 2018 National Survey on Drug Use and Health data, the authors suggest that these improvements are a consequence of increased work capacity relating from an additional form of pain management therapy. Yeah, okay. That's a theory. Similarly, Nicholas and McLean, using data from 1992 to 2012 Waves of the Health and Retirement Study, find that legalization of medical cannabis has a statistically insignificant effect on self-reported pain, but a statistically significant 3.4% increase in self-reported health among older Americans. Among the subsample qualifying for medical cannabis use, passage of a law legalizing cannabis for medicinal purposes leads to a statistically significant 4.8% reduction in reporting pain and a 6.6% increase in self-reported health. Nicholas and McLean also found that passage of a law legalizing cannabis for medicinal purposes leads to a 3.8% increase in weekly hours worked among older adults, conditional on working, with larger effects for those qualifying for medical cannabis use and increases in full-time work. The extent legalization increases measures of economic activity, such as GDP, by simply recognizing activity that's already taking place, it does not necessarily increase tax revenue. Yeah, see, I don't get that, because you're not paying taxes on illegal activity. Please refer to the subsection on other for a more extensive discussion. Cannabis has grown increasingly potent in recent decades, which may have negative consequences for the labor supply and health outcomes of cannabis consumers alike. Okay. Yeah, that's a thought. You get too whacked out. Yeah, you might not be going to work. All right. But it helps the old folks work, so, how do you knock that? Chakraborty, Doremus, and Stith, using county-level data from Colorado, find that laws legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes are associated with a 0.7 percentage point decrease in the unemployment rate, a 4.5% increase in the number of employees, and no effect on labor force participation or wages. Conversely, Sabia and Nguyen find no evidence that laws legalizing cannabis for medicinal purposes affect employment hours or wages among working-age adults. Dave et al. Similarly find little evidence that laws legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes adversely affect labor outcomes. If labor force participation were to increase, we would expect a corresponding increase in revenue due to the resulting increase in real GDP. For instance, a one-time 0.25 percentage point increase in labor force participation as a result of legalization would increase the Congressional Budget Office's baseline labor force growth rate from 0.575% to 0.815% in the first year and slightly higher rates in subsequent 3 years. Real gross domestic product would be on a higher trajectory. If the labor force increase occurred in 2025, federal revenues would increase by $5 billion in 2026 and $58 billion from 2025 to 2023 relative to the baseline. Yes, please, let's pay off the debt. Additional outlays over the budget window would be expected as well, while mandatory spending would decline by almost $10 billion. Higher interest rates would increase debt financing costs. On net, outlays would be nearly $22 billion higher over the budget window, thus the projected net budgetary effect would be $37 billion. Yeah, and I don't understand this outlays thing. I'm just going to admit that. The spending would decline, but the higher interest rates, yeah. This is the part that I like. I'm scratching my head. So anyone want to comment who actually understands federal funding? Fee revenue. Most medical products are subject to federal product regulation by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The FDA is organized into PRAC centers with regulatory funding provided by annual congressional appropriations and or user fees. Most product centers are supported by user fees assessed on product applications, annual product licensing fees, and plant inspection fees. While some lawmakers have proposed a new center for cannabis product regulation, yes, because God forbid we do something without making a government agency, it's also possible that cannabis and cannabis-derived products will be regulated by existing product centers depending on their use. Here we assume prescription for medical cannabis and cannabis-derived products will be regulated by the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, while inhaled recreational products will be subject to regulation under a harm reduction standard akin to the existing appropriate for protection of public health standard for tobacco products as overseen by the Center for Tobacco Products. In this vein, federal revenues will likely include prescription drug user fees from new drug applications for cannabis and cannabis-derived products, and annual prescription drug program fees, and other fees related to manufacturing plant inspections. While only 4 cannabis-derived or related products are currently approved, cannabidol, 2 versions of dronabinol, and naboline, I have no idea what those latter 2 are, it is likely that other product development would be undertaken subsequent to legalization. The magnitude of expected prescription drug development in the cannabis space is unclear, though likely modest, as a significant portion of current medical cannabis use is likely recreational. Okay, yeah, you know what, people shouldn't be judging why people use things or do things if it makes their head and or bodies happier, and, you know, they're not murdering people, etc. Alright. Sorry. Increase in labor supply relative to capital increases the related return on private capital, thereby increasing interest rates economy-wide, including costs of financing federal debt. Okay. Akin to how supplement manufacturers avoid prescription drug regulation by making general health claims instead of product claims related to diagnosis and treatment of disease, it is likely that cannabis product manufacturers and sellers will undertake a similar regulatory-driven market strategy and attempt to be regulated under a harm reduction standard instead of a safe and effective standard of prescription drugs. We expect that Congress will implement a sunsetting 5-year user fee agreement requiring reauthorization for recreational cannabis product regulation. A similar mechanism governs funding for animal drug, generic animal drug, biosimilar, generic drug, medical advice, over-the-counter drug, and prescription drug regulation. This will likely be coupled with a harm reduction standard as the barrier to marketing authorization for recreational products that do not make therapeutic claims, as is currently the case for tobacco products. Thus, the majority of inhaled cannabis products are likely to have a user fee framework similar to most other FDA user fees. I like how they're focusing on the inhaled and say, like, nothing about the edibles and, like, the 900 other ways people have discovered to put cannabis in things, but it's the government. Maybe they're catching up. If user fees for approval of recreational cannabis were set at the midpoint between the fee of an NDA for new drugs and pre-market approval application for medical devices, the average application fee would be $1.8 million, with an annual product licensing fee estimated at $438,746. So I guess we calculate a hypothetical recreational cannabis product application fee as the average of the PMA and the NDA filing fees with data from Food and Drug Administration. Alternatively, fees may be similar in magnitude to those associated with submission of a 510K application. One is significantly lower than the other, okay? We need to make up our minds what we're doing with this government. We calculate a hypothetical recreational cannabis annual product licensing fee as the average of PMA and NDA fees. Okay. I don't know. I don't know if I agree with these numbers, but they're their numbers, so yeah. Given that a significant share of the illicit marketplace may not seek marketing authorization, we assume that 1/2 of the 710 currently marketed unique products in states with recreational markets, and 1/3 of the 1546 unique products marketed in states with medical use will pay user fees, and that while some still seek approval in prescription drugs, the majority will seek marketing authorization under the harm reduction standard. If so, recreational cannabis product user fees would raise an estimated $1.6 billion in application fees and $382 million in annual licensing fees. Oh, okay. We are getting to edibles. I'm sorry. I'm just judging the government here. Edible and liquid ingestible cannabis-derived products would likely be regulated under a product oversight schema similar to supplements, noting that policymakers would have to provide distinct statutory authority for such a framework, as cannabis-derived products are not generally recognized as safe, which is the statutory standard for food additives. Policymakers could also implement a registry fee for foods containing cannabis-derived products, albeit this would deviate from current FDA fee practices. Again, I don't know much about other states. Ours all have to be properly labeled. The dosages have to be properly labeled. And the one time there was ever, like, any sort of product corruption, like the dispo that, you know, might have sold it to us, but I don't think did, just sent out, like, a general message that, like, this thing has been, you know, recalled, so, yeah, don't eat that. Don't eat that. Way too strong. So, I don't know. It works pretty well up here. Not so sure it work on the federal level, but it works well in Michigan. Okay, overall effects on healthcare spending. Spending on cannabis in the healthcare context is of special interest for current purposes due to the federal government's important role in the financing of healthcare expenditures. Overall spending levels will depend on consumption and price, as well as the degree to which utilization is a substitute for or complement to other healthcare products. For example, would cannabis medication for oncology patients be a substitute for or a complement to other pain management treatments? Early preclinical and clinical trial evidence suggests that cannabinoids may play a role as a complement to or substitute for other prescription drugs for a variety of indications. Knowing this, cannabis remains a Schedule I controlled substance that clinical trial evidence is mostly limited to the FDA-approved prescription drug formulations of cannabis's pharmacologically active ingredients. Speaking more generally, the federal ban on cannabis means that research on the consequences of cannabis consumption for health and other outcomes has been severely stunted. Principal public health questions remain unanswered, including both long and short-term health harms from combustion, e.g., the association of cannabis use with myocardial infarction. Oh, geez, okay, that's bad. That's how I'll die. All right. And critical health-related consumer protection questions such as assessing impairment in users who drive. Yeah, they're the ones like me who drive slow as hell. Because small businesses frequently have significantly reduced fees and many products may be classified as a supplement to an existing products have a new application. The program fee may be less. Okay, sure. Observationally, several studies have found that cannabis legalization is associated with a reduction in opioid use and related mortality, suggesting that cannabis and prescription painkillers are substitutes. Bachhuber et al. Find that laws legalizing cannabis for medicinal purposes were associated with a 25% reduction in related mortality. Several more recent estimates are similar. In contrast, Mather and Room find that medical cannabis is associated with higher opioid mortality. It is possible that due to the controversy over the nature of the cannabis product marketplace, legalization occurs with a statutory exception, excluding cannabis-derived products from Medicare and Medicaid coverage, as is currently the case for some product categories such as weight loss drugs. However, it's still worthwhile to consider cannabis's potential effects on Medicare and Medicaid spending. One mechanism through which cannabis could affect Medicaid and Medicare spending is through the decreased utilization of prescription opioids. Bradford and Bradford find that legalization of medical cannabis is associated with a significant decline in Part D prescriptions for pain medication, with the presence of active dispensaries associated with a reduction in 3.742 million daily doses, while home cultivation, as opposed to commercial sale, saw a reduction of 1.92 million daily doses. Specifically, hydrocodone use decreased by 17.4% when state dispensaries were present versus a 9.4% decreasement associated with home cultivation. They further suggest that by 2015, savings to Medicare were as much as $638.8 million per year as a result of state medical cannabis laws, and savings from dispensary-based medical cannabis laws would have been between 1.4 and 1.7 billion. Bradford et al. Find the legalization of medical cannabis is associated with an 8.5% reduction in the Part D prescribing of opioids, while Yang et al. Finds an even larger reduction among Medicaid beneficiaries. Finally, Rahman and Bradford find evidence of the reduced use of drugs prescribed to prevent and treat pain, depression, anxiety, sleep, psychosis, and seizures among Medicaid beneficiaries associated with legalization of recreational cannabis. Another counterbalancing factor, in addition to the expense of cannabis products themselves, is the potential for changes in emergency room visits and substance abuse treatment. Chu studies the effects of medical cannabis laws by analyzing 1992 to 2011 data on drug arrests and treatment admissions across 15 states that legalized cannabis for medicinal purposes before 2012. He finds that these laws are associated with a 20% decrease in admissions to substance abuse treatment centers for heroin-related treatment, supportive of the negative cross-elasticity of demand between cannabis and opioids. Unsurprisingly, he finds no effects on admissions to treatment centers for cocaine, a short-acting central nervous system stimulant, and neither do Conyers and Ayers. The latter do find that for each quarter after Arizona randomly issued licenses to open medical cannabis dispensaries, opioid-related emergency room visits increased by 0.8%. Which seems like that could just be accounted for people moving to Colorado, Arizona, excuse me. They increased, but I don't think this is like a causation. This is a correlation. Anyway, see Anderson and Rees for an overview of the broader body of mixed evidence on the cross-elasticity of demand for opioids. Alright, directly, cannabis-related medical care could increase with legalization and drive medical expenditures. Myron et al. Examined emergency room visits and hospitalization for cannabis hyperesthenia syndrome in Ontario and noted an increase from 0.26 visits per 100,000 individuals in January 2013 to 3.43 visits per 100,000 individuals in June 2021, with an 8.8% of visits resulting in subsequent hospitalization. Okay. If you take really high dose stuff, I guess I could see that. And there are people that do get cannabis-induced psychosis, so it's not for everyone. Early evidence also notes small but significant increases in cannabis use disorder associated with legalization of recreational cannabis. Respondents aged 26 and older who had a cannabis use disorder increased from 0.9 to 1.23%, while the actual expected incidence and prevalence of cannabis use disorder will likely increase. The cost of treatment is currently unclear. Cannabis-derived products may eventually play a significant role in the treatment of mood disorders, such as generalized anxiety disorder. Wah, wah. Consequently, it is expected that as prescription cannabis-derived products may have a significant, albeit yet unmeasured, cross-elasticity with many antidepressants, such as SSRIs and SNRIs. What? I can endorse both of those. If cannabis is deemed safe and effective for the treatment of the approximately 27% of adult Americans with anxiety, it could be cheaper than the other existing pharmacologic options. Yes, and drive a bunch of money away from Big Pharma, which is why things are not happening. It is possible that prescription drug expenditures could decrease as cannabis-derived products compete with antidepressants. Okay, I probably didn't need to read that bit. Medicare spending. Medicare Part D prescription drug plans will likely impose prior authorization requirements, including step therapy, quantity limits, or other restrictions. As the evidence base builds, it is possible that cannabinoid products may become a preferred modality over opioids for the treatments of certain types of pain. It is expected that prescription drug plans will cover FDA-regulated prescription forms of cannabis, but they are unlikely to cover inhaled recreational or edible products. In states that have not yet legalized recreational use, a significant yet unknown share of the current medical cannabis use is likely recreational. Thus, prescription drug plans will likely experience political and policy pressure to cover inhaled recreational and edible forms of cannabis-derived products, and may eventually offer coverage of select products as a supplemental benefit, similar to many prescription-driven plan coverage of over-the-counter products. This is at least initially unlikely, given the lack of definitive medical evidence for their efficacy and the significant lag time required for the initiation, completion, and promulgation of medical research. I'm kind of curious if they would be willing to include them as a possible place for HSA spending, because that could work for you. I don't know. Depends. I'm trying not to read super fast, but that was my last bit of water, so... I didn't think this would sound so long. I always overestimate the amount of time it takes for me to talk. Medicaid spending. Medicaid is funded jointly by the federal government and the states. In fiscal year 2022, the federal government paid 71% of Medicaid costs, ranging from 61% Wyoming to 85.7% in New Mexico. Medicaid drug spending remains a small part of the Medicaid budget, with outpatient prescription drugs representing 5.3% of total fiscal year 2021 Medicaid spending. For a product to be covered by Medicaid, it must be FDA approved, which will likely limit the number of cannabis products available. Cannabis product manufacturers must also elect to participate in the Medicaid marketplace, which they may decline to do due to low reimbursement rates. Utilization controls in Medicaid managed care are likely to be stricter than the effective open formulary existing in the traditional Medicaid program. Finally, it's worth noting the effects of different Medicaid financing structures. Among Medicaid beneficiaries, 72% receive their health benefits through managed care organization paid on a capitated basis. As the Medicaid benefits package is relatively rich with low consumer out-of-pocket responsibility, managed care entities have responded by maintaining programmatic affordability through the deployment of narrow networks and increased utilization review tools such as prior authorization. Thus, even if covered in some form, it is likely that cannabis products, except for those highly specific uses, will remain out of reach for Medicaid beneficiaries and will not trigger significant new spending. Yes, but if you can pay for them with HSAs, that might help a whole hell of a lot, says Deja. Veterans Health Administration spending. The VHA provides health financing and integrated care delivery for an estimated 92 million veterans. While prescription cannabis is prohibited within the VA, both the House and Senate have passed legislation in different bills to permit VA doctors to provide recommendations on medical cannabis use in states where medical cannabis is permitted. Currently, FDA-approved prescription drugs that include an active ingredient from cannabis, e.g. dronabinol, are available to veterans. If cannabis were federally legalized under the framework above, VHA spending on prescription cannabis would surely increase. As noted above, spending on other medical services and products will likely change. Political activity by veteran service organizations could result in the VA covering other forms of cannabis products, potentially increasing expenditures. Subsidies for private health insurance. Similar to the Medicare and Medicaid markets, private health insurance markets may experience slight shifts in product utilization as health exchange enrollees or those with employer-sponsored insurance shift from prescription opioids or recreational tobacco to cannabis and cannabis-derived products. In the Affordable Care Act exchange market, any FDA-approved prescription cannabis product, including the current 4, would be available to enrollees, albeit likely subject to stringent prior authorization and utilization review requirements. Other forms of non-prescription cannabis would likely remain uncovered, excluding the vast majority of cannabis users whom one would expect to utilize products authorized under a harm reduction standard. Due to historical policy and political disagreements over the Obamacare market, this would be unlikely to change, excuse me. In the employer-sponsored insurance market, cannabis products authorized under a harm reduction standard would likely be covered by some plans with richer benefits, likely due to employee demand, similar to how chiropractors, acupuncturists, and other things are covered. Products would likely be subject to prior authorization and step therapy. For example, the North Carolina State Health Plan implements multiple utilization management tools, prior authorization, step therapy, quantity limits. Ooh, so exciting. As the employee population is significantly healthier than the Medicaid and Medicare populations and would likely have less medical demand for cannabis products in a setting of more available access and coverage, the magnitude of the impact of cannabis coverage in the ESI market is likely similar to or less than the government-funded programs. Thus, cannabis legalization may have very small effects on ESI expenditures and a negligible impact on the tax subsidy for ESI. Farm subsidies. Now, this is something I hadn't thought about, so I know it's 45 minutes in and you're all tired of hearing my voice and I'm getting scratchy, but this is some interesting stuff, people. If cannabis is grown on land currently used for subsidized crops, it will reduce farm subsidies. A back-of-the-envelope calculation gives a sense of the potential magnitude of reduction. The total amount of cannabis produced in the United States was estimated to be about 24,000 tons. Yield of dried plant per acre is about 1.3 tons per acre, so production of the 24,400 tons would require about 18,800 acres. Last year, the area planted to subsidize crops like wheat, corn, soybeans, cotton, rice, and peanuts exceeded 230 million acres. 18,800 acres is thus a minuscule share of our subsidized cropland. I'm not going to go into why we're subsidizing farming, especially when a lot of it's big agro. Anyway, while cannabis production may well increase after legalization, not all of it will take place on land previously allocated to subsidized crops, given that federal farm subsidies have averaged about $16 billion annually. Holy shikes! Much more recently due to temporary pandemic relief programs. If 18,000 acres of cannabis production displaced subsidized crop production, subsidy spending would likely be reduced by only a few $1 million. This is a sad, okay. I'm sure there's a reason we spend so much on farms, but somebody explain it to me. Of course, if cannabis were to become a federally recognized crop, it would be possible that producers would get their own subsidy program. Yeah, I would not argue for this. Do we do this for beer? Like, I know beer comes out of wheat, so maybe we do. In this context, it is important to note that the federal crop insurance program, multi-peril crop insurance, already covers hemp for fiber, grain, or CBD. Drug enforcement spending. Yeah, we could cut the hell out of that. Following Merritt and Waldock, we first estimate federal drug spending on drug enforcement by summing agencies' final budget authority for drug control in the president's budget and appropriating funds based on the percentage of cannabis-related arrests. So in 2022, federal spending totaled $19 billion for all drugs. In 2019, the most recent year with FBI data, 3% of arrests for drug abuse violations were for cannabis sale or manufacturing, and 32% for possession. Again, people just leave people alone. Let them do what they want. Therefore, the total share of drug abuse arrests for cannabis was 35%. Apportioning funds this way brings the total amount spent on cannabis prohibition to $6.7 billion, as shown in Table 3. And this is cannabis. This is not meth. This is not heroin. This is cannabis. We're wasting nearly $7 billion on cannabis prohibition. Sorry. I don't like wasting my money on imprisoning people that are doing anything particularly harmful to themselves. It's just nonsense. Nonsense. All right. Sorry. Probably don't want to hear all my theories on that's nonsense. All right. This number is likely to be an overestimate of the potential for spending reductions for at least two reasons. First, one may question whether agencies or departments that devote substantial effort to the source country side of drug control policy, like the Defense and State Departments, allocate their resources across drugs in this fashion. Yeah, they don't really think of it as that. They sort of focus on where they're coming from. Second, while there is evidence that cannabis legalization is associated with reduction in violent crime, we deem it unlikely that federal legalization will lead to immediate or even eventual reductions in these agencies' budgets. Of course not. Instead of budget cuts, we would expect these agencies to refocus their attention on other law enforcement activity with unclear, if any, consequences for the federal budget. Yeah, we're not going to cut any money to to cops. Or the State Department, or anything like that. We just figure out something else to do with these DEI guys. Don't worry. Don't worry. You spent the money, and you can continue spending the money. We just reallocate them. All right. There will be significant but uncertain budgetary consequences to both revenues and outlays at the federal level if cannabis is legalized. On the revenue side, the largest potential effect arises from an increase in labor force participation, although it is hard to say how large the effect will be based on current knowledge. This may in part be justified by the fact former cannabis dealers may continue their career in the illicit drug industry after legalization by substituting other illegal drugs. Okay, I could switch from dealing dope to dealing other stuff, but I feel like the people that, unless they're just dealing dope to their friends, you're already dealing other stuff. I mean, you're either a mixed bag or you just cannabis. Because most people don't want to deal with all the other fun people that do other fun things. All right. That's just my experience. Increases in net tax revenue from excise tax on cannabis, though complicated by offsetting factors, could be significant as well. Other changes to revenue from the corporate income tax on cannabis producers or from FDA fee revenue are likely to be of a smaller order of magnitude. On the spending side, the single most important factor in determining the direct budgetary implications of federal legalization of cannabis will be whether cannabis products will be treated as normal prescription drugs. If they are, the federal government will end up picking up a significant share of the bill for spending on cannabis through Medicare, Medicaid, and Veterans Health Insurance, although these costs may be offset by reduced spending on other forms of health care. If cannabis legalization increases aggregate spending on private health insurance, the tax expenditure for private health insurance will increase. A variety of factors limit the likely budgetary outlay effect. Most cannabis companies are likely to seek marketing authorization from the FDA under harm reduction or supplement-like regulatory standard, thus excluding them from mandatory public payer coverage. The few companies that seek marketing approval as a prescription drug will likely be up-tiered on health plan formularies and be subject to utilization review tools such as prior authorization. Thus, most cannabis and cannabis-derived products are likely to be distributed through retail sales channels subject to significant regulatory restrictions such as adult-only venues, like Virginia state's ABC stores for liquor sales, cannabis-only sales venues with controlled access, or designated as behind-the-counter products. And that's how it is in Michigan. You have to go to a dispo. Medicare Advantage plans and employer-sponsored insurance could potentially cover some non-prescription cannabis products as supplemental benefits. Medicaid managed care and ACA exchange plans are unlikely to cover these products given the more political nature and scrutiny of these markets, along with the emerging but still weak evidence of clinical efficacy. Furthermore, in the setting of stringent coverage, it is most likely that cannabis products will be used as a substitute for other existing products such as opioids or gabapentin, thus serving as a substitute rather than product complementary role. So again, we're taking away from Big Pharma. Big Pharma no lack. Indirect effects of cannabis legalization may also impact federal outlays. For example, if legalization of cannabis leads to a decrease in opioid utilization, a subsequent reduction in mortality from opioid abuse, there would be increased outlays in Medicare and Social Security due to increased longevity. Oh, okay, so we don't have enough poor, frustrated people dying quickly. They may live too long, and then we'd have to pay for them. Okay, yeah. God forbid we have people not turning to bad drugs. Many of these budgetary implications are highly contingent on decisions yet to be made by policymakers. Take the excise tax on cannabis. While determining the socially optimal excise tax on cannabis is beyond the scope of this paper, it is worth noting the range of considerations associated with such a determination. In an unencumbered market, for a good with negative externality, an excise tax equal to the difference between the private and social costs of consumption can raise the cost of the good to reflect both private and public costs, curb demand, and generate revenues equivalent to the social harm. Again, other than taxing, I mean, yeah, okay. I guess taxing is intended to curb demand on sin tax. Yeah, okay. I don't know if it's generating revenues equivalent to the social harm. I'm just happy the roads are getting fixed, and I don't think that's offsetting whatever social harm smoking weed has in Michigan. All right. However, in a highly regulated market where non-tax measures limit competition, such as licensing restrictions that limit the number of sellers in the market and detailed product regulation, prices will likely exceed marginal costs and reflect an implicit tax. Determining the appropriate excise tax requires knowledge of the social costs of cannabis consumption. Okay. Is there any? And the implicit tax arising from regulatory restrictions. The implicit tax equals or exceeds the optimal tax, or if there is no negative externality, the optimal tax is 0 or negative. Yeah, I'm thinking 0, guys. That's just me. For example, Thomas examines Washington State's tax and regulatory policies governing cannabis sales and finds licensing restrictions which limit the number and location of cannabis sellers, reduce competition, and result in higher prices. Yeah, an artificially restricted market will do that. Washington State's cannabis tax rate was 37%, but Thomas finds the combination of regulatory and tax policies yielded a demand equivalent to a free entry market with a 63% excise tax. In other words, regulatory restrictions on sales reduced demand for cannabis by a similar degree as the tax, albeit without generating any state revenue. Yeah, which is why free market, just let them all fight it out. Come to Michigan. It's fun. Everyone's fighting it out up here. This dynamic has potentially important implications for federal cannabis policy and the appropriate federal excise tax rate and the appropriate subsidy rate through the federal healthcare programs should be considered in conjunction with an estimate of the impact of regulatory restriction on competition and price. Finally, while the budgetary impact of federal legalization of cannabis reflects both the impact on revenues and outlays, it is not necessarily optimal to intentionally set the excise tax regime such that revenues equal outlays. Such an arrangement where taxes on privately financed consumption funds publicly financed consumption is as appropriate as funding public schools by they tax on private schools. That said, the net budgetary impact of federal legalization is important for reasons of congressional procedure and politics more generally. Okay, so the budgetary impact reflects, is not necessarily optimal to set it such as everything is equal. Yeah. Taxes on privately funded consumption. Publicly financed consumption. Okay, so I think they're saying something like excise tax on sin goods going back to fund people buying it through Medicare, maybe that's what they're saying. I don't know. Yeah, y'all have hung in with me for an hour, and I truly appreciate it. I know I probably am mush-mouthing this towards the end. They have a lot of references. I'm quickly just scrolling down to the appendix just to look at it. I'm not going to read much of it because, again, my jaw's getting tired, and I'm sure my husband would like me to make some food. Oh yeah, we're doing maths down here. So those of you who are good at maths, feel free to come and take a look at this. I was gonna say I'll post the link in the description, but I don't think it's out there. But you should be able to Google this because again, it's a U.S. government document, so your tax dollars at work. But yeah, I'm just gonna look at Michigan real quick here. So yeah, we were legalized in 2008. God, that seems forever ago. Oh, that was medical use. Okay, that makes sense. I'm like, wait a minute, it wasn't legal and I worked at such and such. And then our rec use was decriminalized in 2018, or legalized, not decriminalized. Nobody's nice enough to just decriminalize things. I'm like not tax them, but whatever. I will just take my like 50% freaking tax rate on anything I buy in Michigan. It's just like, oh my gosh. So total revenue like 163 million, per capita revenue like 16. I don't know if that's million. Probably is million. Or $16 per head. Not so bad. All right, we just keep it moving. Excise tax revenue by state, both 3%, 18 cents. What is this? Oh, tax revenue by population, the billions, and tax over. Okay, these are exciting tax charts. Okay, thank you all for enjoying me on this super long review, and I'm just gonna poop this all the way up to the front so everybody remembers what the heck we read, or in my case, know what we are going to type in there. So once again, thank you so much, American Enterprise Institute, for doing this analysis of the implications of cannabis legalization on the U.S. federal budget. May we balance our budget and eliminate our debt so those of us who are still young enough to retire can, like, I don't know, actually have a good latter half of their life. Thank you for listening this long, and hope you have a good day. Feel free to leave some comments.